Hello, evil minions. It is I, your mean and evil overlord. Okay, and you've been waiting for it, and here it is. This is part 5 of the 5 causes of the Spanish-American War. This one's going to be a little longer than the others, so we're going to get right to it. All right? So, hopefully you have your notes ready, and if you haven't filled them out yet, go ahead and get this finished. Hopefully today. This assignment will be due tomorrow on Tuesday, the 28th. If you're running behind, that's okay. Turn it in when you can, but get it in when you can. All right. And if you're having any problems, let me know. So let's get right on to it. All right. Okay. So we have looked previously at the first 4 of the causes of the Spanish-American War. We looked at the Cuban Revolution. We looked at yellow journalism. We talked about the Delome letter and nationalism or war fever, or kind of this extreme patriotism. All of those, the first 4 causes, are what we call long-range causes. Those are things that unfold over time. They are things that aren't as immediate as some of these other things. The Delome letter, a little bit, was kind of an immediate thing, but all that did was just kind of add fuel to the fire. And that's actually the analogy I'm going to use. If you're building a fire in your fireplace or at your fire pit when you're camping, these first 4 reasons, those are all the things that you use to start that fire. You know, you've got some dry kindling, maybe some wadded up newspaper, maybe one of those little pieces of balsa wood or the pine cone coated with things to make it burn a little bit, and some small twigs. All of those things are long-range causes. But to actually get the fire started in your fireplace, you need a spark. You need something that sets all of those things ablaze. And our 5th cause today, the sinking of the USS Maine, that is your spark. That is an immediate cause for war. That is an event that takes place that people just can't go, oh, okay, well, tomorrow's another day. This is an event, just like Pearl Harbor started World War II for the United States. The sinking of the USS Maine, pushed the United States into war. So let's step back a little bit and look at why the Maine was there. Why is the U.S. interested enough to send a warship to Cuba when things, tensions are already high? Why do you send a warship into an area like that? Well, during this time, there were still U.S. businesses trying to operate in Cuba to the tone of $50 million worth of U.S. investments are in Cuba, which was a substantial amount of money during that time. You had U.S. property owned by these U.S. businesses being damaged in the Cuban revolt that had been going on for several years now. And the Spanish government had been told by the U.S. government, you need to make sure you're protecting the U.S. citizens that are there in Cuba. You have to make sure that they are not getting hurt by either the rebels coming in or your pro-Spanish forces, your Spanish military. You've got to protect U.S. citizens that are there in Cuba. And a lot of that wasn't being done. There were businesses being damaged. U.S. citizens did end up being hurt. When you've got, basically a war going on, there will be innocent people hurt. It happens all of the time. So the pressure was on. You ended up with these pro-Spanish riots in January of 1898. Those were people rioting against the revolutionaries in favor of Spain. There were people in Cuba who wanted to keep Spanish rule, who thought that that was okay, and it was mostly Spaniards who had been there for a while. There were riots, and people were getting injured. And President William McKinley, U.S. President, needed to protect U.S. lives and business interests there. Also, Germany sent in 2 of its warships into Havana Harbor in an attempt at some gunboat diplomacy. Germany had taken over a lot of colonies in the Pacific. They were competing for remaining colonies. Remember, imperialism was sweeping the superpowers on the planet. Great Britain, Spain, and Germany was one of them. Germany was interested in expanding. The Kaiser was interested in making sure that they had their piece of that pie that we saw in our imperialism lesson. So, U.S. wasn't the only one that had noticed Cuba. Germany sent over warships into the harbor, and it was looking very much like Germany was going to try to kind of weasel in between Cuba and the United States to try to take over Cuba for themselves. And that probably was the biggest reason why McKinley ended up sending the Maine. Now, the USS Maine, you can see a very old, grainy picture down here in the corner, was one of the most modern new warships on the planet. It was one of the steam-powered metal hull ships, all the latest technology. The United States Navy was second only probably to Great Britain at this point, but they had all of these new steamships that countries had been building for the last couple of decades at this point, and the U.S. Navy was pretty strong. So they sent in the USS Maine into Havana Harbor in early 1898. In fact, January 25th of 1898. You can see the captain of the Maine here, Captain Sigsbee, dapper-looking gentleman there, nice manly mustache going on, and he pulls his ship into Havana Harbor in January of 1898. And why was it sent to Cuba? For those reasons that we just talked about, mostly because of these two German warships that were there. So they're all sitting in Havana Harbor, eyeballing each other, across the decks, wondering if there was going to be an issue, or if there was, everybody was going to just mind their own business and go about their day. Nobody was really super sure. So they pull in January 25th, and things are okay for a while. And then February 15th, about 20 days after it pulled in, about 3 weeks, there is an explosion in Havana Harbor, and the USS Maine is ripped apart in that explosion, and it sinks in Havana Harbor, killing 267 of the sailors on board. That was a pretty big percentage of men on that ship. That was a big chunk of them. Well, that was huge news. And our yellow journalism folks, Hearst and Pulitzer, as you might expect, are going to run with this. So let's examine this a little bit. Again, Captain Sigsbee here, his ship is destroyed. He has survived. He and some officers were not on board the ship at the time. So he sends a telegram back to the United States, to the War Department. And he says, hey, we've got this thing here, and we are going to, here's what we know. So we're going to look at the telegram that he sent. And I want you to pick out, as we look at this, pick out some facts that he gives versus opinions in this message. So there's that. And then I want you to remember that this telegraph that he sends back to the War Department is pretty much the first message that is sent to the United States. This is the first bit of news about this that gets into the United States. And based on this telegram, the New York Journal and the New York World both get copies, and they both start publishing stories. Now, the real story about what happens in Havana Harbor is not known for quite a while during this time. It takes days and weeks and even months to get it all sorted out. But the newspapers didn't want to wait. So the newspaper starts publishing story after story after story. And if you remember when we talked about yellow journalism, Yellow journalism is exaggerated stories, kind of quote-unquote made-up facts about stories, and I want you to analyze this Telegraph versus what the papers ultimately do. So let's go ahead and read what Sigsbee wrote about this explosion. All right? And this is dated February 16th, 4 a.m., just a few hours after this explosion. Maine blown up in Havana Harbor, 9:40 p.m. and destroyed. Many wounded and doubtless more killed and drowned. Wounded and others on board Spanish man-of-war, that's a type of ship, and Wardline steamer. There was a kind of a steamboat or like a cruise liner there in the harbor. Send lighthouse tenders from Key West for crew and few pieces of equipment still above water. A lighthouse tender is kind of a small tugboat type thing. No one had other clothes other than upon him. Public opinion should be suspended till further report. All officers believed to be saved. Many Spanish officers, including representatives of General Blanco, now with me and express sympathy. And it's signed Sigsbee. All right. So that is the entirety of the message that was sent to the War Department, Navy Secretary Long, at this time. Now let's look at the newspaper reports based on this telegram. We are going to first look at the New York Journal. Look at this headline. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, that's Teddy Roosevelt, who later becomes president, convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. $50,000 reward for the detection of the perpetrator of the Maine outrage. And look at all the exclamation marks around here, right? And if you look down here, the caption of this picture, naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. Now, let's go back. Does there anywhere in there say that this was a Spanish mine? Or that there were Spanish perpetrators or any of that? I don't see it. All of this, work of an enemy, not an accident, Spanish mine, perpetrator of the outrage, that is all yellow journalism. That is all just fanciful speculation on the part of the newspaper. Okay? And the New York World is no different. Maine explosion caused by bomb or torpedo, and the print that I found cuts it off. I've seen others. That's a question mark, and that's a trick a lot of newspapers use. They won't make a statement like it's caused by a bomb or torpedo. They'll say caused by a bomb or torpedo question mark, leading you to believe that that's in fact what it is. Captain Sigsbee and Consul General Lee are in doubt. All right. The world, now that doesn't mean that, the nations of the world got together and sent a special tug. It means the world newspaper has sent their own tug with submarine divers to Havana to find out. So before they have even figured out what's going on, this newspaper has said, we're going to send people down, we're going to send divers, and we're going to figure this out. All right. Does that sound weird to you? It says in a suppressed dispatch to the State Department, the captain says the accident was made possible by an enemy. Is that what he said? It seems to me he said the exact opposite if we go back. Public opinion should be suspended till further report. Well, we're seeing public opinion here and newspaper opinion here. All right. So these are two prime examples of yellow journalism. This is why once the war started, the Spanish-American War started, the New York Journal was bragging about, how do you like the Journal's war? Do you remember that from part 2, I think it was? Take a look at the picture, by the way. You see this picture? Take a look at this picture. This was a picture that was run back then, how is that yellow journalism? Well, if we were in class, we'd have a discussion about this, but since we're not, I will tell you. You see, in this explosion, this terrible explosion, you see these larger than real life images of U.S. sailors being caught in the explosion. As if the American people needed a reminder that, hey, sailors died in this explosion. And just in case you forgot, we're going to very clearly depict these men on this ship dying in this explosion, right? When in reality, that's not how explosions really work. That's not generally how people look when they're involved in an explosion. But it was designed to make an emotional appeal to the readers. And it certainly did. All right. So let's take a look after the fact, going back. And this isn't even, you don't even have to go too far after the event to kind of figure out what happened. There's good evidence to believe that they knew kind of this pretty quickly after the explosion. But we also have looked at the explosion of the USS Maine through modern investigative techniques, and we drew pretty much the same conclusion that they drew back then. And let's look at it. All right. I want you to look at this diagram of the ship. Now, the way the steamship works is you heat up water, it creates steam, and the force of that steam expanding from water, because if you remember your fourth grade science, states of matter and things like that, or wait, that's fifth grade, you know that when something goes from a liquid to a gas, it expands. Okay, that's how steam engines work. You heat up water, it turns into gas, and that expanding, vapor, water vapor, turns a turbine, which powers the engine. To heat that water up back then, you needed coal. So all of these ships had big storage rooms full of coal. And coal is dug from the ground. It burns really hot. We have kind of the same concept in our modern day charcoal grills. It's slightly different, but the principle is the same. And so this is the diagram of the ship. And you see coal bunker, all around, all these coal bunkers. And right in the middle of this, you have a magazine. Now, in military terms, a magazine is a storage room for ammunition. It's a storage room for cannonballs, gunpowder, all kinds of things that make weapons work are stored in a magazine. So let's look at the process. You've got a coal bunker here, and you've got a magazine, ammunition right here. Anybody see a possible issue? Because you've got coal, explodey things, and fire. Let me do that again. Coal, which is a burny thing, next to fire, next to explodey things. Burny things, explodey things, and fire. Do I need to say it again, or do we have it? In 1986, a technical analysis of the USS Maine, it was conducted, I forget who did it, but it was a research study. And it said found no technical evidence that an external explosion initiated the destruction of the Maine. Now, external means coming from the outside versus internal, which means from the inside. The available evidence is consistent with an internal explosion alone. The most likely source was heat from a fire in a coal bunker adjacent to the reserve magazine. Now, if you are on a ship like this and you've got a fire room, You have coal dust. Coal, again, if you've ever dumped out charcoal briquettes into a grill, you know you get that kind of black soot type dust, coal dust, all over everything, all over your fingers. If you pick up a piece of charcoal, you get, all that black, charcoal dust on your fingers. That's everywhere in a situation like this. And of course, in a fire room, you're going to have sparks and all that type of thing. And what they speculated happened was that a spark ignited some coal here in this coal bunker, or one of the coal bunkers, and that it started to burn. And eventually, it started to burn and got so hot that it melted its way through the wall, separating the coal bunker from the magazine. And boom, it exploded. And analysis after analysis has come to that same conclusion. And there's evidence to think that they knew that was going on. They started looking at other ships that were designed the same way not too long after the Maine exploded, and found a number of issues related to that, and they corrected them before more explosions happened. But they knew what the problem was. But that did not stop President McKinley from using the Maine to make a series of demands to the Spanish government. All right. First of all, they needed to pay for the USS Maine. They needed to pay that money. And that is, he issued that probably knowing that it wasn't Spain's fault. He said, you've got to stop this reconcentration policy going on. The things that we're seeing, this brutality has got to stop. You have got to end this. We need a complete ceasefire in Cuba. This whole revolt thing needs to stop. We need to calm down. We can't continue this way. And you're going to grant Cuban independence. You're going to stop this reconcentration policy. It's going to be a ceasefire, and you're going to do that by saying you're moving out of Cuba. You're going to let Cuba be. Now, McKinley did this with the idea that if Spain moved out, guess who could move in? Good old Uncle Sam. We'll take care of you, Cuba. Look what we did for you. We got rid of those mean Spaniards for you. Don't you love us? That was McKinley's plan. Now, something to think about. Spain gave in to all of the first three demands, even though they knew that they had not sunk the Maine. They said, okay, we'll pay you for the Maine. We'll stop this reconcentration policy. We'll have a ceasefire in Cuba. And they even agreed to a limited plan for Cuban independence. They weren't prepared to get rid of it completely. They weren't stupid. They knew that the U.S. was going to swoop in the second they left. So they said, well, we'll give Cuba more say, Cuban people more say in their government. We'll still be in charge, but we're going to switch it over to more of a protectorate type situation, which was one of the ways that countries did imperialism, if you'll remember that back then. They said, we'll switch from a colony to kind of a protectorate, but we're not leaving completely, but we will let them rule themselves. And that's what they said. So they agreed to basically 3.5 of Kinley's demands. But that wasn't good enough for McKinley. So he goes before Congress and gives a speech. He didn't actually ask Congress for war, but he gave this speech before Congress, and it was a longer speech than this. But in it he said, in the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, in behalf of endangered American interests, which gives us the right and duty to speak and to act, I ask Congress to authorize and empower the President to use the Army and Naval Forces of the United States as may be necessary for these purposes. Okay? So he didn't say declare war, but he just said authorize my use, and Congress has to authorize the use of the military. The President can't just go to war with somebody. Congress has to authorize it. But he said, hey, look, tensions are high. We may need to use the Army. We may need to use the Navy in a snap situation, and I need you to give me permission to do this. And during this speech, he talked about some of the things going on in Cuba to try to convince Congress to do that. He talked about this reconcentration policy and the brutality of it. He talked about damage to U.S. businesses in Cuba and the danger and anarchy in Cuba, which could overflow into the United States. And he said, all of these things are a problem, and I may need the Navy and the Army to help keep Americans safe with all these things going on. What didn't he mention? He did not mention the USS Maine at all. Because at this point, he probably already knew that that was not the fault of Spain. And he didn't want to be on record as saying that it was if he knew that it wasn't. Okay? So what's not listed there? The Maine. However, Congress not only agrees to authorize the use of the Navy and the Army, they declare war on Spain. And so it's on from here. They authorize the president to use the Army and Navy, and they direct him and basically say, we are in war with Cuba because all of the people, back home in our home states are screaming at us to do something about Spain. So because we're politicians, we're going to go ahead and authorize the use of war against Spain. So go do it, McKinley. You wanted to use the Army and Navy? You go use the Army and Navy. You go, boy. All right? And that leads to the Spanish-American War that started in 1898. And we'll touch on the actual war itself next time. But for the most part, the war was over before it began. Essentially, Spain realized, look, we don't care about the Philippines enough. We don't care about Cuba enough to go to war with the United States. So they fought a little bit, got defeated in a couple of battles, and ultimately they said, you know what, you can have it. And they walked away. And that is, in a nutshell, what the Spanish-American War is. But we can look at the after effects there. So anyway, that is it. We will conclude our 5 causes of the Spanish-American War with this. And the reason we talk about these 5 reasons, these causes, because typically what you see here as the cause for the Spanish-American War generally ends up being the cause of most wars. Nationalism, this idea that we have to protect interests and all that, and in some cases it's legit, other cases maybe not so much, but certainly a lot of these factors will play in to the start of World War I, and we will look at that very soon too. We're not going to go quite as in-depth on the causes of World War I because in many instances they mirror these causes, and I don't have to reteach it to you. But anyway, that's where we're at, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. I will get this uploaded just as quickly as I can, and you guys finish up and get this in as quickly as you can. All right? I miss you, and I will hopefully see some of you very soon. Peace. If anyone has a hidden immunity idol and would like to play it, now would be the time to do so.